Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Israel's government is under increasing pressure. This weekend, some hostage families joined large anti-government protests calling for new elections.
Prime Minister Netanyahu pushed back, claiming new elections will only help Hamas. At the same time, reports are surfacing that the terror group is collapsing from within. CBN's Julie Stahl has more.
The largest group representing hostage families formally joined anti-government protests for the largest rallies since the October 7th massacre. They are calling for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition to go because it failed to free the hostages, alongside those who've wanted to oust Netanyahu for years.
This is a government that has failed us repeatedly from last year, that when they tried to pass the judicial overhaul.
6 months after the massacre of October 7th, that in order to win, we need new leadership. In order to bring back the hostages, we need new leadership.
The Tikva Forum, another group representing families of hostages, issued a statement saying, a significant number of abductees' families are shocked by the political activity. They also believe a continued military campaign is the best way to free the hostages. Just before he underwent successful hernia surgery Sunday night, the Prime Minister held a news conference. He also struck back at calls for new elections, saying they'll freeze Israel just before it defeats Hamas.
They will paralyze the negotiations for the release of our hostages. They will bring the war to an end before the completion of its objectives. And the first to bless it will be Hamas, and that says everything.
Israeli forces completed a 2-week operation against Hamas terrorists in Al-Shifa hospital. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant says captured Hamas leaders are admitting the terror group is collapsing from within. Despite public pressure to end the fighting, the Biden administration approved shipments of fighter jets and thousands of bombs to Israeli forces. While the fighting has affected Easter celebrations, a large crowd showed up for the Resurrection Day sunrise service at Jerusalem's Garden Tomb. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell joins us now from Jerusalem. So, Chris, let's talk about the protests. How serious is this challenge to the ruling coalition?
Well, Gordon, it's a serious challenge, but maybe not the threat that actually can overthrow the government. It's very impressive to see tens of thousands of people out in the streets. And this is a coalition, as Julie showed in her report, a coalition of people before October 7th that wanted to topple the government and some of the hostage families. But as she said, not all of the families. Some of the families of those hostages are really mortified that politics should be involved at all. And they say the attention should be on Hamas and Qatar, the ally of Hamas. But, Gordon, I think the most serious threat to the government appears to be the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox protests, and a draft law. What this draft law would do would permit or force many of the ultra-Orthodox into the IDF, into the army, but they don't want to go there. Many of this laws opposed by the religious parties, and they're in Netanyahu's coalition. So this actually threatens the internal cohesion of the government. And so if any one of these religious parties that are part of Netanyahu's coalition decided to leave, then that could actually topple the government. So it's actually more of a threat than what we see in the streets, these tens of thousands of protests against the government. And as Netanyahu said, he thinks elections, regardless, would paralyze the nation during a time of wartime, playing into the hands of Hamas.
Well, there's an old adage that you never switch horses midstream. I mean, don't they absolutely need to finish this war in Gaza before they can even think of elections?
I would think so, Gordon. Politically and militarily, maybe you may not want to change the leadership right now, especially on the political echelon, to finish the job. And I would say the majority of Israelis are behind those war aims of the cabinet and the security cabinet and the war cabinet, and they want to finish the job to make sure that Hamas no longer poses a threat to civilians on the southern border, much less central Israel as well.
Let's move on to Hamas. You know, the report that they're disintegrating from within, and you know they've lost all command and control and all of these things. Is Hamas more of an idea than an actual organization? Are we going to see something similar to Al-Qaeda or ISIS, where you can defeat them militarily, but then they just morph into these other groups where people take the name and commit terror acts, and there's no central coordination at all?
Well, I think you see two things here, Gordon, right now. In terms of the ideology, I don't think the ideology's going to disappear, even if Israel completes its military campaign. So that, I think, will remain. It was birthed back in the 1920s with the Muslim Brotherhood. On the other hand, I think right now we're seeing a morphing of the insurgency. That's why many of the terrorists came back into the Al-Shifa hospital, where the IDF had an operation there. So in northern and central Gaza, I think we're seeing that kind of insurgency, but also in Rafah. That's the main thing where the main military operation of Hamas remains, those 4 battalions. Why Israel says it's so critical, despite U.S. opposition and international opposition, to destroy Hamas's military operation there in Rafah.
Well, let's talk about the Al-Shifa hospital and what Israel accomplished there. I think one of the things that is not being reported or underreported is that Israel was able to do that without injuring a single doctor or nurse or medical tech. It just seemed to be incredible that they could go in and capture that many terrorists and no one else got harmed.
Remarkable, Gordon. 6,000 civilians were evacuated. No patients or medical staff, as you said, was killed. They captured 500 terrorists, and they killed and eliminated 200, which Hamas was using that as a terror base. And they found large amounts of weapons throughout the hospital, including the maternity ward. And Hamas had used the hospital after Israel had an operation there back in November, to use the staff and patients as human shields. Military historian John Spencer says that no army in the world has done more than the IDF to reduce the number of casualties, and yet achieve the kind of military accomplishments they have.
Well, let's talk about the remaining attacks against Hamas, and specifically about a report that Israel is now starving people in Gaza. Any truth to that, and what is Israel trying to do to protect civilians?
Well, Israel's criticizing that report that says, Gaza is on the verge of a famine. COGAR, which is the coordination of government activities in the territories, say there's no limit to what the amount of aid going in. They reject that claim that Israel is starving the civilian populations. They've admitted more trucks after October 7th than they had before. Senator Lindsey Graham was here in Jerusalem just a few days ago. He calls that a blood libel. He says Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war, and yet he says Israel doing what they can to make sure the people of Gaza don't starve. And he said, never in the history of warfare is Israel doing more to help combatants or help the population and lessen the effect on the population on the other side. He puts the blame on Hamas for hiding in tunnels behind women, children, and the elderly.
All right. Well, Chris, thank you for your insights, and let's all join with you in praying for the peace of Jerusalem. For you at home, be sure you're watching what is the source of reports on Gaza. Anything coming out of the so-called Gaza Ministry of Health, that's a propaganda arm of Hamas. It's been shown again and again and again that their reports are false. And so, why should we ever believe that? What Israel is trying to do is defend itself, and under international law, it has every right to do so.